Did people tell you that you were too sensitive? That you were overreacting? That it wasn't a big deal? Maybe you remember feeling hurt, scared, embarrassed, or upset, only to have someone explain why you shouldn't feel that way. Maybe you heard things like, "You're being dramatic. Stop crying. You're fine. You're making a big deal out of nothing." And after hearing those messages enough times, something started to change. You stopped expressing certain feelings. You started questioning your reactions. You apologized for being upset. You learned to hide emotions before anyone else could dismiss them. But what if psychology suggests something important? What if the problem was never your emotions? What if the real problem was that your emotions were never taken seriously? Because when feelings are repeatedly dismissed, children often learn something far more damaging than people realize. They don't stop feeling. They stop trusting what they feel. And that lesson can quietly follow them into adulthood for years. Psychology suggests something important. Children learn how to understand themselves through the way their emotions are treated. When a child feels sad, scared, hurt, or overwhelmed, they naturally look to adults for guidance. Not just to solve the problem, but to understand what their feelings mean. Attachment psychology suggests that caregivers act as emotional mirrors. They help children learn. What I'm feeling makes sense. My emotions are real. It's safe to express how I feel. But when emotions are repeatedly dismissed, minimized, or criticized, something different happens. The child begins receiving a very different message. Not necessarily through words, through repetition. When sadness is called weakness, when fear is called overreacting, when hurt is ignored, the nervous system starts adapting. And over time, the child may stop trusting their emotional experience. Not because the feelings disappear, because expressing them no longer feels safe. Psychologists often refer to this as emotional invalidation, a pattern where a person's emotions are consistently dismissed, minimized, or treated as unimportant. The difficult part is that many children don't respond by becoming more emotional. They respond by becoming less connected to their emotions. They learn to question themselves, to suppress what they feel, to look outside themselves for answers. Children learn how to see themselves through the way their emotions are treated. And when feelings are repeatedly dismissed, one invisible lesson often takes root. Maybe I can't trust what I feel. And that lesson can quietly shape relationships, self-confidence, and emotional health for decades. For many people, the damage didn't come from being told not to feel. It came from being taught that their feelings weren't valid. Maybe you remember being upset about something that genuinely hurt you. And instead of being met with understanding, you heard, "You're fine. It's not a big deal. Stop being so sensitive." Or maybe you were scared, anxious, embarrassed, overwhelmed. And someone responded with, "There's nothing to be afraid of. You're overreacting. Just get over it." At first, these moments may seem small. Most people don't look back on them and think of them as life-changing. But psychology suggests that children are constantly learning from these interactions, not just about emotions, about themselves. Because when a child says, "I'm sad," and repeatedly hears, "No, you're not," the lesson isn't simply about sadness. The lesson becomes, maybe my experience isn't real. When a child says, "That hurt," and hears, "You're being dramatic," the lesson becomes, maybe my feelings are too much. And when this happens again and again, the nervous system starts adapting. Children naturally depend on adults to help them understand the world, including their inner world, their emotions, their reactions, their needs. But when those emotional experiences are consistently dismissed, minimized, or criticized, children face a difficult choice. They can trust what they feel, or they can trust the people they depend on. Most children choose the second option because their relationship with caregivers is essential for survival. So instead of questioning the adults around them, they begin questioning themselves. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I'm making a big deal out of nothing. Maybe I shouldn't feel this way. Over time, these thoughts become automatic. The child stops expressing certain emotions, stops talking about what hurts, stops asking for emotional support, not because the feelings disappear, because they've learned those feelings won't be understood. And perhaps the most painful part is that many emotionally invalidated children become incredibly good at hiding their emotions. They look calm, mature, easygoing, low maintenance. But underneath, they're often carrying emotions they've never fully learned to trust. Because the deepest lesson of emotional invalidation isn't, my feelings don't matter. It's something even more damaging. Maybe I can't trust myself. When feelings are dismissed often enough, something subtle begins to happen. The child doesn't just doubt their emotions. They begin doubting themselves. At first, the questioning seems small. A child feels hurt and thinks, maybe it's not that bad. A child feels scared and thinks, maybe I'm overreacting. A child feels upset and thinks, maybe I'm the problem. But over time, these thoughts become a habit, and eventually, they become a way of seeing the world. Psychology refers to this as internalized invalidation. Instead of hearing dismissive messages from other people, you begin repeating them to yourself. The voice that once came from outside slowly moves inside, and years later, it can sound like your own thoughts. You second-guess your reactions. You question your instincts. You wonder if your feelings are reasonable. You look for proof before trusting your own experience. Even when something clearly hurts you, even when a boundary has been crossed, even when your emotions are trying to tell you something important, part of you immediately begins arguing with yourself. Maybe I'm being too sensitive. Maybe I'm making this bigger than it is. Maybe everyone else would handle this better. Over time, this creates a deep sense of uncertainty. Not because you lack intelligence, not because you're incapable, because you've been taught to distrust one of your most important sources of information, your own emotional experience. And when self-trust is weakened, people naturally begin looking outward for answers. You rely on other people's opinions before trusting your own. You seek reassurance before making decisions. You ask others how they would feel before acknowledging how you feel. Because somewhere inside, an old belief is still operating. I can't fully trust myself. And that belief doesn't stay limited to emotions. It begins shaping relationships, decisions, boundaries, self-confidence, even your sense of identity. Because when you've spent years questioning what you feel, you eventually start questioning who you are. And that quiet self-doubt often follows people into adulthood in ways they don't immediately recognize. Because the child who learned not to trust their feelings often becomes the adult who struggles to trust themselves. One of the most common consequences of having your feelings dismissed is chronic self-doubt. Not just doubting your emotions, doubting your decisions, your instincts, your perceptions, your judgment, and eventually doubting yourself. Because when children repeatedly learn that their emotional experiences are wrong, they often stop treating themselves as a reliable source of information. Instead of asking, what do I think? They begin asking, what would other people think? Instead of trusting their instincts, they look for reassurance. Instead of feeling certain, they feel unsure, even about things they know. You may spend hours analyzing a decision, replaying conversations, questioning whether you handled something correctly, wondering if your reaction was justified, searching for evidence that your feelings make sense. Not because you're irrational, because you've been trained to question yourself before trusting yourself. Psychology suggests that confidence is not simply believing you're always right. Confidence is trusting yourself enough to listen to your own experience, And when emotional invalidation happens repeatedly, that trust becomes difficult to develop. So many adults find themselves caught in a cycle. They feel something, then immediately question it. They make a decision, then wonder if it was the wrong one. They set a boundary, then feel guilty for setting it. They recognize a red flag, then convince themselves they're overreacting. It's as if every emotional signal is followed by a second voice, a voice that says, "Are you sure? Maybe you're wrong. Maybe you're being too sensitive." Over time, this creates constant mental exhaustion because every choice becomes a debate, every feeling becomes a question, every instinct becomes something that requires outside confirmation. And eventually, many people begin depending on reassurance from others. Not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack awareness, but because they never learn to trust their own inner experience. The painful irony is that many of these people are actually highly perceptive. They often notice things others miss. They sense emotional shifts quickly. They recognize problems early. Yet they still doubt themselves because their issue isn't a lack of insight. It's a lack of trust in that insight. When your emotions were repeatedly dismissed, certainty became difficult. Not because you're incapable of knowing yourself, because you were taught that your inner experience couldn't always be trusted. And nowhere does this create more pain than in relationships. Because when you don't trust your own feelings, it's very easy to trust everyone else's perspective more than your own. When you grow up learning that your feelings are wrong, something important starts to happen. You stop looking inward for validation and start looking outward. Because if your emotions can't be trusted, then maybe someone else's opinion can. This is one of the reasons emotional invalidation often leads to people-pleasing. Not because people-pleasers are weak, not because they lack personality, because they've learned to trust other people's perspectives more than their own. If someone disagrees with you, you immediately question yourself. If someone is disappointed, you assume you've done something wrong. If someone is upset, you feel responsible for fixing it. Because somewhere deep inside, you're still searching for confirmation that your thoughts, feelings, and reactions are acceptable. Over time, approval becomes more than something you enjoy. It becomes something you depend on. You may find yourself constantly checking how other people feel about you, looking for signs of acceptance, avoiding behaviors that could upset someone, avoiding conflict even when something matters to you. Not because you don't have opinions, because expressing them can feel risky. After all, if your emotions were dismissed growing up, disagreement may feel less like a difference of perspective and more like proof that you're wrong. So, you stay quiet. You accommodate. You adjust. You make yourself easier to accept. You say yes when you want to say no. You agree when you're unsure. You prioritize other people's comfort over your own truth. And gradually, your boundaries become harder to maintain. Because boundaries require self-trust. They require believing that your feelings matter enough to be respected. But emotional invalidation often teaches the opposite. It teaches, maybe my needs aren't that important. Maybe other people know better than I do. Maybe I should just go along with it. The painful result is that many people become experts at understanding everyone else's feelings while becoming disconnected from their own. You know what other people want, what other people expect, what other people need. But when someone asks, "What do you want?" the answer isn't always clear. Because for years, your attention has been focused outward, seeking approval, avoiding rejection, maintaining harmony. And while people-pleasing may create temporary acceptance, it often comes at a significant cost. You begin abandoning parts of yourself to keep other people comfortable. Because when you don't trust your own emotions, it's easy to trust everyone else's perspective more than your own. At this point, it's important to understand something many people whose feelings were dismissed never hear. Your emotions were never the problem. The way they were treated was. For years, You may have believed that you were too sensitive, too emotional, too reactive, too much. But psychology suggests a very different perspective. Human emotions are not mistakes. They are natural responses to our experiences. Sadness is not weakness. Fear is not failure. Hurt is not irrational. And emotional pain is not proof that something is wrong with you. The problem begins when a child repeatedly receives the message that their inner experience cannot be trusted. Because eventually, that child stops questioning the message and starts questioning themselves. That's why so many adults carry shame about emotions they should never have been ashamed of. Not because their feelings were inappropriate, because they were taught that those feelings were unacceptable. But being told your emotions are wrong does not make them wrong. Being ignored does not make your experience invalid. Being misunderstood does not mean your feelings were unreasonable. It simply means those feelings were not met with the understanding they needed. The truth is that many of the patterns we've discussed in this video, self-doubt, people-pleasing, emotional suppression, difficulty expressing needs, are not character flaws. They're adaptations. They are survival strategies developed by a nervous system trying to maintain connection, acceptance, and safety. You were not born distrusting yourself. You learned to. And if those patterns were learned, they can also be unlearned. Healing begins the moment you stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What happened that taught me to stop trusting my own feelings?" Because the goal is not to become someone different. The goal is to reconnect with the parts of yourself that were never the problem in the first place. Understanding where these patterns come from is important. But healing requires something more. It requires learning to trust yourself again. And for many people whose feelings were dismissed, that can feel surprisingly unfamiliar. Because for years, you've been taught to question your emotions before listening to them. So the first step is simple. Pause before dismissing yourself. The next time you feel hurt, anxious, frustrated, disappointed, or overwhelmed, resist the urge to immediately explain the feeling away. Instead, ask, "What am I actually feeling right now?" Not what you should feel, not what other people would feel, what you feel. The second step is learning to validate your emotions before trying to solve them. Many people move straight into fixing mode, analyzing, rationalizing, explaining, but emotions often need acknowledgement before they need solutions. Try saying, "This feeling makes sense. Of course I'm upset. Given what happened, it's understandable that I feel this way." Validation doesn't mean every reaction is perfect. It means recognizing that your emotional experience deserves attention rather than immediate judgment. The third step is rebuilding trust through small emotional signals. Pay attention to moments when something feels right, when something feels uncomfortable, when a boundary feels necessary, when a situation leaves you drained. Your emotions are constantly providing information. The goal isn't to obey every feeling automatically. The goal is to stop ignoring them. Because self-trust isn't built through certainty. It's built through listening, little by little, moment by moment. Healing begins when you stop treating your emotions like enemies and start treating them like messengers. Because the feelings you spent years doubting may actually be some of the most important guides you have. And the more you learn to listen to them with curiosity instead of criticism, the more you begin rebuilding something emotional invalidation often took away. Trust in yourself. Before this video ends, there's one thing I want you to hear. If your feelings were often dismissed growing up, you were not too sensitive. You were not too emotional. You were not too much. You were a child trying to make sense of your emotions. And like every child, you deserve to be heard. You deserve to have your feelings taken seriously. You deserved emotional safety. The fact that other people didn't understand your emotions does not make those emotions invalid. And the fact that you learned to hide them does not mean they didn't matter. If you've spent years questioning yourself, doubting your feelings, or wondering whether your emotions are reasonable enough, you're not alone. Many people are still carrying those same lessons into adulthood. So I'd love to hear from you. What message did you hear most growing up? Was it, "You're too sensitive"? "Stop overreacting"? "It's not a big deal"? Or something else? Share your experience in the comments. And if psychology videos like this help you understand yourself more deeply, subscribe to Lee Psychology. This is a safe place to explore the patterns that began long before adulthood and learn how to rebuild trust in yourself. Because understanding your emotions isn't weakness. It's where healing begins.